The city was a monument to Arthur Vance's ambition. A skyline of steel and glass that reflected his own cold, sharp image back at him 1,000 times a day. From his penthouse office on the 82nd floor, the world below was a schematic, a collection of assets and liabilities. People were merely numbers moving through the grid he'd helped design. Arthur Vance was a king in a kingdom of his own making, a millionaire many times over, whose hands had shaped the very bones of the metropolis. But one of those hands had betrayed him. It started as a flicker, a faint tremor in his right thumb, as subtle as a moth's wing against a window pane. He'd ignored it. Then it became a persistent hum, a low-voltage current that ran from his wrist to his fingertips. His signature, once a bold, decisive slash of ink, began to fray the edges. He could no longer hold a drafting pen steady enough to sketch the elegant, impossible arches that had made him famous. His doctors, the best in the world, the kind you paid in figures that could buy a small island, called it an idiopathic tremor, a fancy word for we have no idea. They gave him pills that dulled his mind but not the shaking. They suggested therapies that cost a fortune and delivered nothing. His hand, the very instrument of his power and creation, was becoming a cage for a frantic, trapped bird, and it was destroying him. One evening, as the city bled orange and purple in the twilight, Arthur left his tower of glass. He was in a foul mood, the tremor particularly bad that day. He'd shattered a crystal glass during a board meeting simply by trying to lift it. The silence that followed the crash was louder than any accusation. As he strode towards his waiting town car, its polished black surface mirroring his tailored suit and his furious expression, he nearly collided with her. She was sitting on the edge of a large stone planter, her form small against the granite and chrome of the plaza. A young black woman, her clothes warm but clean, her hair a beautiful, chaotic storm of tight coils. She wasn't begging. She wasn't asking for anything. She was just watching the river of people flow past, her gaze deep and unervingly still. As Arthur passed, her eyes met his, and for a reason he couldn't fathom, she saw him. Not the suit, not the reputation, but the frantic bird beating itself bloody inside his hand. Her voice was low, not much more than a whisper, but it cut through the city's roar, like a perfectly tuned bell. "There's a storm in your hand," she said. Arthur stopped. He turned, his face a mass of irritation and disbelief. "Excuse me." She didn't flinch from his glare. Her eyes, the color of rich, dark soil after rain, held his. "I can calm it. I can make it still." A harsh, incredulous laugh escaped Arthur's lips. It was a sound that had withered competitors and silenced boardrooms. It was a weapon. Here on the street it was just ugly. "Oh, can you? And what's your price? A consultation fee? Let me guess. It's whatever I have in my wallet." The girl's expression didn't change. There was no shame in her, no fear, only a quiet, unshakable certainty. She slowly rose to her feet. "Feed me," she said, "and I'll heal you." The simplicity of it was so absurd, so utterly preposterous, that Arthur laughed again, louder this time. The sound bounced off the glass walls of his building, a monument to his power, mocking this girl's impossible claim. "Feed you," he scoffed, shaking his head. "Lady, you have a lot of nerve. You want a meal? Fine." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick roll of bills, peeled off 100, and crumpled it in his good hand. He tossed it at her feet. The bill landed on the pristine granite, a wilted green leaf. "There," he sneered. "Go buy yourself a feast. And stay away from me with your little street hustle prophecies." The girl looked down at the crumpled $100 bill. She didn't move to pick it up. She just looked at it, then back up at him. A flicker of something that might have been pity, or perhaps disappointment, crossed her face before it settled back into that unnerving calm. "That's not food," she said softly. "That's paper. It has no life in it. You can't heal a storm with paper." Arthur's chauffeur, a stoic man named Thomas who had seen Arthur at his best and worst, opened the car door. Arthur gave the girl one last look of utter contempt and slid into the leather-scented sanctuary of his car. As the vehicle pulled silently away from the curb, he glanced back. The girl was still standing there, the crumpled bill still lying at her feet, untouched. And for a fleeting moment, the tremor in his hand felt worse, a vicious, angry buzzing, as if it were mocking him, too. The days that followed turned into weeks of escalating private hell. The tremor became a constant, violent shudder. He could no longer hold a phone to his ear. He delegated the signing of all documents to his vice president, a man whose ambition Arthur could now feel breathing down his neck. He became a recluse in his own office, a king trapped in his throne room. The world he had built with his hands was now a world he couldn't touch. He drank expensive scotch from a wide-mouthed tumbler he could grip with both hands, the amber liquid sloshing, a storm in glass mirroring the one in his flesh. He spent hundreds of thousands of dollars chasing a cure. He flew to a clinic in Switzerland where they injected him with experimental neurotoxins. The tremor paused for 6 hours and then returned with vengeance. He sought out a guru in a remote mountain monastery who told him to meditate on stillness, but the shaking in his hand was a deafening roar that drowned out any hope of inner peace. He bought a hyperbaric chamber. He hired acupuncturists and hypnotists. Nothing worked. The storm raged on, and Arthur Vance, the man who could bend steel and glass to his will, was being broken by a whisper of his own failing nerves. His empire began to feel the tremors, too. A crucial deal was fumbled because he couldn't sketch a last-minute design change on a napkin for a client, a bit of old-school showmanship. That had once been his trademark. Rumors began to circulate, whispers of a breakdown, of a loss of control. The sharks in the corporate waters began to circle. One night, alone in his sterile penthouse apartment that overlooked the city, he dropped a priceless porcelain vase. It shattered on a marble floor, the sound echoing the breaking of his own composure. He sank to his knees, his right hand shaking so uncontrollably it looked like it was trying to tear itself from his arm. And in that moment of absolute despair, her voice came back to him, as clear as if she were standing in the room. "Feed me, and I'll heal you." The arrogance, the ridicule, it had all burned away, leaving only the cold ash of desperation. The memory of his own laughter filled him with a sudden, nauseating shame. He had laughed at her. He, a man who had paid $1 million for a single day of stillness, had laughed at her offer and thrown paper at her feet. The next morning, a different Arthur Vance walked into his office. The fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by a haunted, hollowed-out look. He summoned his executive assistant, Evelyn, a sharp, perceptive woman who had worked for him for a decade and was one of the few people who knew the true extent of his condition. "Evelyn," he said, his voice raspy, "I need you to find someone." "Of course, Mr. Vance." "A specialist." "No, not a specialist." He struggled to describe her. "She's a young woman. Black. On the street, outside our building. It was a few months ago. I spoke to her." He omitted the part where he'd laughed and thrown money at her. The shame was a physical weight in his chest. Evelyn's face was a professional mask, but her eyes were knowing. She nodded. "I'll check the security footage from the plaza." For 2 days, Evelyn and the head of his security team scoured months of footage. They finally found the encounter. A grainy, silent video of a titan of industry sneering at a woman in worn clothes. They watched him toss the bill. They watched her leave it on the ground. There was no audio, but Arthur's derisive laughter was plain to see in the cruel curl of his lip. Evelyn said nothing, but her silence was a judgment. Finding her was another matter. She wasn't a regular on that corner. She wasn't in any of the city's homeless shelters or databases. It was as if she had materialized from the air and vanished back into it. Arthur grew more frantic. He offered a ridiculous reward to his security team. They turned the city upside down, showing her grainy photo to street vendors, beat cops, and outreach workers. Finally, a lead, a fruit vendor, remembered her. Said she sometimes helped out at a community garden. Tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city, a small patch of green life wedged between 2 derelict warehouses. Thomas drove Arthur there. The gleaming town car looked alien and obscene, parked on the cracked pavement of the industrial street. Arthur got out, his tailored suit a mockery in this place of rust and weeds. He walked through a broken chain-link fence, and the city noise began to fade, replaced by the gentle hum of bees and the rustle of leaves. The garden was an oasis of defiant life. Rows of tomatoes and kale grew in raised beds made from reclaimed wood. Sunflowers, tall and proud, stood sentinel at the edges. And there, kneeling by a patch of herbs, was the girl, Elara. He had learned her name from one of the other gardeners. She wore the same calm expression, her hands covered in dark, rich soil as she gently tended to a basil plant. She didn't seem surprised to see him. She looked up as his shadow fell over her, her eyes taking his expensive shoes, his desperate face, and the uncontrollable tremor in his hand, which he was trying and failing to hide in his pocket. This time, there was no laughter in him. There was no arrogance. He was a supplicant. "I found you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Ilera wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek, her movements slow and deliberate. "You looked in the wrong places," she said. Her voice was not accusatory, merely factual. I need your help," Arthur stammered. The words felt like swallowing glass. "My hand. It's worse." "I know," she said, her gaze fixed on the trembling limb. "I'll pay you," he said, the old habit dying hard. "Anything you want. A house. A scholarship. Name it. Just make it stop." Ilera stood up, brushing the soil from her knees. She looked at him, and for the first time, Arthur felt the true depth of her gaze. It was ancient. It saw through the layers of wealth and power down to the terrified, broken man beneath. "I already told you my price," she said, her voice soft but firm as bedrock. "Feed me?" Arthur was ready for it this time. "Yes, of course. Where?" "The finest restaurant in the city. You can order the entire menu. I'll have my driver take us." She shook her head slowly. "No, not a restaurant. Not a chef. Not your money." She pointed a dirt-stained finger at him. You feed me. Right here. With your own hands." He stared at her, uncomprehending. "What? What do you mean?" "You want me to cook." The idea was as foreign to him as flying. The only time he entered his own kitchen was to get ice for his scotch. "There's a grill over there," she said, gesturing to a small, charcoal-fired kettle grill near a picnic table. "There are vegetables here." She swept her hand across the garden. "And there's a market 2 blocks away. You can buy some bread, some fish, something simple, something with life in it." It was the most humiliating, absurd request he could imagine. Arthur Vance, a man who commanded legions of assistants, chefs, and servants, was being told to go grocery shopping and cook a meal on a rusty grill in a public garden for a homeless girl. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to call her insane, to walk away. But then he looked at his hand. It was shaking so violently that his whole arm vibrated. The storm was now a hurricane, and she was his only port. He swallowed his pride. It tasted like bile and ash. "Okay," he croaked. "Okay." The next hour was a symphony of quiet degradation for Arthur Vance. He walked to the market, his fine Italian shoes scuffing on the gritty sidewalk. He felt 100 pairs of eyes on him. This man so clearly out of his element. He fumbled with cash at the fishmonger's, his shaking hand dropping coins on the floor. He bought a loaf of bread that was still warm, and the simple, honest smell of it was so alien to him. Back in the garden, he struggled with the charcoal. He got soot on his $1,000 suit. He couldn't get the fire to light. He, who had raised skyscrapers, was defeated by a handful of briquettes. Ilera watched him from the picnic table. Saying nothing, her presence a silent, patient testament to his incompetence. Finally, a kindly old man who was tending to his peppers came over and showed him how to build a fire, speaking to him as if he were a slow child. The humiliation was a fire in Arthur's own cheeks. He washed the vegetables, zucchini and bell peppers, and an outdoor spigot, the cold water splashing onto his silk shirt. He tried to slice them with a knife he'd bought, but his tremor made it impossible. The blade skittered, and he nearly cut himself. He was shaking not just from his affliction, but from rage and frustration. This was impossible. It was a trick. He was about to give up, to throw the knife down and scream, when Ilera walked over. She didn't take the knife from him. She simply placed her cool, soil-dusted hand over his trembling one. She didn't say a word, but a strange thing happened. Beneath her touch, the frantic hummingbird in his hand seemed to quiet just a little. The violent shuddering eased into a manageable tremor. It wasn't gone, but it was calmer. He looked at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Just guide it," she whispered. "Don't fight it. Let it be part of the work." And so he did, with her hand gently resting on his. He managed to slice the vegetables into rough, clumsy chunks. He seasoned the fish with salt and lemon. He placed it all on the grill. He cooked. For the first time in his life, Arthur Vance prepared a meal. He served it on 2 paper plates. The fish was slightly burned on one side. The vegetables were unevenly cooked, and the bread was just bread. It was a mess, a failure. But as he sat down opposite her at the worn picnic table, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time, a profound sense of exhaustion that had nothing to do with stress or work. It was a simple, grounding fatigue of effort. Alara picked up a piece of the fish with her fingers and ate it. She closed her eyes for a moment. "It has life in it," she said quietly. She ate slowly, deliberately, savoring every bite. She ate the burnt parts and the undercooked parts without complaint. She ate as if it were the finest meal she had ever tasted. Arthur watched her, his own plate untouched. He was waiting for the magic, a flash of light, a sudden, complete cessation of the tremor, a miracle. But nothing happened. She just ate. When she was finished, she wiped her hands on a napkin and looked at him. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the garden. "Tell me about your hand, Arthur," she said, using his first name for the first time. "What about it? It shakes. It's useless." "No," she said. Before the storm. What did it do?" He thought for a moment. "It built things. It drew plans. It signed contracts. It made me who I am." "It took," she said, her voice not an accusation but a simple observation. "It took land to build on. It took money in exchange for designs. It took control. It held power. A hand that only takes eventually forgets how to receive. It clenches so tight it begins to fight itself. A storm is just energy with nowhere to go. You filled your hand with so much power, it has no room for peace." Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. He thought of his life, a relentless, joyless pursuit of more. More buildings, more money, more influence. Taking, acquiring, controlling. He never stopped to just hold, to feel, to connect. His hand had become a symbol of his soul, clenched, restless, and at war with itself. "What did you do today, Arthur?" she continued, her voice gentle. "With your hand." He looked at his hand. It was smudged with soot and smelled of fish and charcoal. I shopped. I cut vegetables. I made a fire. I cooked." "You served," she corrected him softly. "You gave. For the first time in a long time, your hand wasn't taking. It was offering. You fed me, and in doing so, you fed the part of yourself that has been starving." As she spoke, he felt it. Not a sudden jolt, but a slow, deep-seated unclenching. It started in his chest, a warmth that spread down his arm, into his wrist, and pooled in his palm. He looked down at his right hand, resting on the table. The tremor, the violent, ceaseless shudder that had plagued him for a year, was gone. It was just still. He lifted it slowly, flexing his fingers. They obeyed. There was no resistance, no traitorous current. He could feel the grain of the wood under his fingertips. He could feel the cool evening air on his skin. He could feel his own pulse, steady and calm. Tears welled in his eyes, hot and shameful, but he didn't fight them. They streamed down his face, washing away months of fear and despair. He looked at Alara, this impossible girl, this prophet in a community garden. "How?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "How did you do that?" "I didn't do anything," she said, her work finished. "You did. The healing was in the making, in the giving. The meal was the medicine. You just had to be willing to prepare it." She stood up to leave. Arthur scrambled to his feet. "Wait. Let me give you something. Please. You have to let me." He was reaching for his wallet, his mind still trapped in the old patterns of transaction. She held up a hand, stopping him. "You already have, Arthur. You gave me a meal. The debt is paid." She smiled, a small, genuine smile that transformed her face. "The real payment is what you do now, with your quiet hands." And then she was gone, walking away through the growing dusk, disappearing back into the city's fabric as mysteriously as she had appeared. Arthur Vance stood alone by a rusty grill in a hidden garden, his hands finally, blessedly still, his entire world remade. He didn't go back to the man he was, The stillness in his hand had seeped into his soul. He returned to his glass tower, but he no longer saw it as a throne. He saw it as a cage he had built for himself. He began to dismantle it, not by selling his company, but by changing its very foundation. He started a foundation, funded by his own vast fortune, to create and protect green spaces, community gardens like the one where he'd been saved, all over the city, places of life in the canyons of steel. His first project was to buy the land with the 2 derelict warehouses and gift it, in perpetuity, to the gardeners. His hands, once instruments of acquisition, learned new skills. He learned to plant seeds, to prune roses, to feel the life in the soil. He found more joy in watching a tomato ripen than he ever had in watching a skyscraper reach its final height. The man who once laughed at a hungry girl's plea now spent his weekends serving meals at his shelter, understanding that the exchange of a simple plate of food was more powerful than any contract he had ever signed. He had been healed of a tremor, but he had been cured of a far deeper sickness. The illusion that a man's worth is measured by what he can take, rather than what he can give. His hands were quiet now, but for the first time in his life, they were truly strong. The world is full of storms, both in the weather and within our own souls. It is easy to believe that power lies in walls of glass and coffers of gold, to laugh at the quiet wisdom found in forgotten places. But true power, true healing, often comes not from what we can buy, but from what we are willing to give. It is found in the simple, profound act of recognizing another's humanity and offering a piece of our own in return. The proud will always be humbled, and the arrogant will always be brought low, not by a vengeful force, but by the quiet, undeniable truth they chose to ignore. If you believe that compassion is the ultimate strength, and that humility is a key to true power, subscribe for more stories that unmask the powerful and uplift the unseen.